Thanks very much, and I'm glad to be back at ITS. I spoke here one time before, about 15, 16 years ago on congestion pricing, so it is nice to be back. I've been doing transportation policy now for about 30 years, and when I started working in this area, these were the problems: congestion, bad pavements, deficient bridges, projects that cost more than their benefits, battles over gas tax. Every single one of those problems is still with us, and many of them are more serious than they were 30 years ago. You know the old thing about if you continue doing the same thing and think you're going to improve, well, that's what drove me to write the book. Here's, that's what we face every day, most of us. The new study on cost of congestion, the direct cost, came out from Texas Transportation Institute a couple of weeks ago. $166 billion a year in wasted time and fuel. Average cost per commuter in all large and medium metro areas over $1,000 a year. Here in California, $2,400 per commuter. San Francisco, almost the same. New York City, almost $1,800. Pretty bad. And those are only the direct costs. The economic productivity loss is at least equal to the direct cost. So the cost to our economy, particularly to our vitality of our urban areas, is much greater than just that. You may not realize how bad this is, but this organization, the Road Information Project, does a report every 2 years, Bumpy Road Ahead, summarizing data using federal highway data, and they have a model that is vetted by transportation engineering people, calculating the annual cost, wear and tear, and depreciation due to poor pavement condition. And so San Francisco, over $1,000 a year per vehicle due to sloppy, bad highway conditions. And I tell you, when I lived in Florida now for 16 years, I come here and drive on California roads and freeways, I'm appalled at the condition they're in compared to Florida. It spends a lot of money on it, but they're really superb, and Texas does the same. So there was the I-35 bridge collapse in Minnesota a few years ago. Over 54,000 structurally deficient bridges across the country. And the backlog gets, there's been some minor progress on this over the last few decades, but every year, this is a continuing problem because every year, as bridges age, new ones get into this category and some get fixed. So the progress is minuscule from one year to the next. That's a terrible stream. Look at Rhode Island, 23% of all its bridges on federal and state highways. California is relatively good on that, only 6%. So there's something to cheer about for California anyway. And this was Sarah Palin, the famous Alaska Highway to Nowhere, Bridge to Nowhere, excuse me. Now, the good result from that was a Congress banned earmarks. The earmarks were responsible for a great many federal grants for projects whose benefits were much less than their cost. But every state legislature, all state legislators face the political incentive every year to get projects for their districts that they can cut ribbons on. That's much more politically beneficial to them as individuals than proper funding of maintenance. So we have a problem with too many projects being selected on and on and on, more for political reasons than economic. How many states do you know where there's a benefit cost requirement that's enforceable by law on highway projects of a certain size? I don't know of any. And this is really tragic because we're wasting limited, scarce resources. Here's a snapshot of some California statistics. The Reason Foundation's 24th Annual Highway Report came out a few weeks ago. And we ranked the states on measures of spending, safety, congestion, and I think those are the three main measures. And there's a bunch of things, they all add up to a cost-effectiveness index. And this is the overall rank from number 1 being best to 50th being worst. California is in 43rd place. Interstate condition is 45th place. Urban area congestion, we all know, is really bad, 48th place. Efficient bridges is in 19th place, which is relatively good. It's in the top quarter. So that's the one area. Then the other problem, battles over gas tax increase. So now California recently did, voters approved a big increase in fuel taxes, long overdue. because of the underspending and poor allocation of spending. But most states are seriously underfunding highways and other transportation. The original users pay, users benefit premise on which gasoline taxes were invented by the state of Oregon and copied by all other states within a decade. Oregon started in 1919, so it's 100 years old this year. And that same principle, users pay, users benefit, was in the Interstate Highway Act of 1956. That's been watered down in just about every state and at the federal level to where 20 to 25% of the revenue goes for other transportation, but not directly to benefit highway users. And I think that partly contributes to the voter resistance to fuel tax increases at the state level and to congressional reluctance to raise the federal fuel tax since 1993, because voters see it as just another tax, and they don't think there's any likelihood that they will benefit. They only know they're going to pay more if they agree to that. But here's what's looming. This is a projection from CDM Smith, which is a traffic projection and transportation consulting firm, of the future revenues, federal plus state, over the next 40-some years. And the top line is if there were no increases in federal fuel economy requirements. The green line that you see there is with reasonable projections of the effect of increasing federal fuel economy requirements wending their way through the fleet as old gas-guzzling diesel are retired and replaced by brand new vehicles that meet 45 or 50 mile per gallon standards. And the line below that as a projection of electric vehicle, probably a fairly optimistic projection of electric vehicle entering into the fleet with zero gallons used. And so by 2045, there could be a $50 billion per year shortfall, short of fuel tax increases of that magnitude. But they would have, they'd have to raise that money on a diminishing base of vehicles that use fuel or use lots of fuel. This is a major problem that so far our governance process, for the most part, is not really dealing with or taking seriously. Now, in the book, I lay out a vision. Stop doing what we're doing. Rethink the system, how we pay for, how we manage, how we procure. That could, I think, lead to largely uncongested freeways, dedicated truck lanes on major routes, which has a whole raft of benefits, no toll booths anywhere, but per mile charges everywhere. Excellent maintenance that's built into the system, not as an add-on from the legislature when they feel like it. The ability to expand when and where needed because the funding mechanism is already in place, and a true users pay, users benefit system of funding. And the question is, well, how could we get here from there to here? This is the big challenge I face, is trying to, is this just a pipe dream, or is there a plausible path toward a vision like that? So the first thing I said was, well, maybe we have the wrong overall institutional model. And I looked at all the main vital infrastructure that we depend on, except highways, is organized as utilities. And people understand utilities. They get bills, they pay the bills. And I'd like you to think about, you have probably no idea how much you pay for your highway bill every month. But you probably know what you pay for all of these. Now, these are the figures in the book, and they're from I think 2010, so they're a little out of date. But it doesn't matter. The relative magnitudes are what's important. These are national average figures from about 2010 for electric bill, household electric bill, telephone, natural gas, cable, satellite, etc. Now, the big question mark is highways. What would you guess is your monthly household bill for federal and state fuel tax payments? Any guesses? Wild guesses?
Over 100.
Okay, that's one guess. Kind of what I usually get as suggestions for people. Whoops. $46, again, in 2010. Now, there's been some fuel tax increases since then. Most people have the foggiest idea what they're paying. Now, in a state with tolls, you have to add some tolls to that and so forth. But the point is, it's not transparent. It's completely opaque. And there's all kinds of different pots of money that go into it. There's no one party that you could hold accountable for delivering the results of what you pay. It's just, and I actually spoke at I think it was an AASHTO conference and gave some version of this. And somebody said, but Bob, we don't want it to be transparent. We want it to be opaque. That's one man's view, and I thought it was just really irresponsible. But I think transparency is part of the problem. Lack of transparency is part of the problem. So, just to clarify, highways are different from all these other utilities. The others are all businesses, whether they're run by a government agency or whether they're run by investor-owned companies. Now, we have municipal utilities. Los Angeles Department of Water and Power is a municipal electric and water utility. Most of America has municipal water departments, but they run as businesses. They meet all the characteristics of businesses. Of course, your cell phone company is a business. Your gas provision is a business, and so forth. You pay the business directly based precisely on how many thousand gallons of water you use, how many kilowatt hours you consume, whatever your phone plan is, how much you use. You get a bill, and the money goes to pay solely for the capital and operating costs of that utility. Now, highways are vastly different, as you know, when you think about it. But they could be any of the methods that we use. I mean, we also have utility co-ops, rural telephone and electricity co-ops. There's several thousand of these around the country. I mean, several people, including Gabriel Roth, one of my mentors, have suggested highway user co-ops, for probably more for rural areas than for urban areas. But that's another possible model. Highways would charge per mile driven in my model. They would have the revenue stream to add capacity when it's needed, not having to go through a decade of political process to argue about where the funding would come from. They would have to decide, in order to get them financed by the bond market and by other investors, they have to have a return on investment, ROI. They have to show that the benefits are greater than the cost. What a concept in our highway world. And one of the things that just appalled me when I started seriously working with state DOTs and so forth, the verbiage, the language, talked about the people who operate vehicles on the highways as users. Now, your cell phone company doesn't call you a user, they call you a customer. Your water department calls you a customer. Your electric utility calls you a customer. Language matters. State DOT can't call you a customer because you don't pay them. You pay the legislature. And the legislature is really the customer of the highway, of the DOT. This is a very different model, and I think these things are part of why we have such a problem. Now, in terms of could we actually move toward what I'm talking about, I do have a chapter in the book about the history, the forgotten history of 19th century private turnpikes in America. There were thousands of these. Dan Klein at UC Irvine and another professor who's deep in his work have documented this. There's numerous papers available on what interesting institutions these were. No, they all eventually failed because they couldn't compete with railroads and canals. But that's neither here nor there. The principle was out there, and it worked for many, many decades. After World War II, the major motorway systems of 4 major European countries, France, Italy, Spain, and Portugal, were developed as toll finance projects. Many of them, and by now all of them, as done by investor-owned companies under long-term franchises. You drive on the motorways in France. That's where you're paying tolls to companies that operate them under long-term franchises. You drive on expressways in Brisbane, Melbourne, and Sydney, and most of them are this model also. It started migrating there toward the end of the 20th century. And in Latin America, in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Peru, Mexico, all have growing amounts of investor-financed, long-distance, modern, limited-access toll roads under long-term franchises, like electric utilities have. And I don't know how many of you realize that electric utilities in America are not the same kind of businesses as General Motors. They have a franchise from the government that is between 50 and 99 years in most cases. At the end of that franchise, and they have to comply, and they have a regulatory agency and so forth. At the end of that term, the government can decide, do we renegotiate another franchise with that provider, an incumbent? Do we put it out to bid and let the incumbent bid, but other newcomers can bid? Or do we take it over and run it as a government utility? That's the system, and that's what I say is a model that's what these countries are using, all of these countries, and have increasingly decades of experience using this model, and it's working quite well. Not perfectly, but it's working generally quite well. Well, we had made a start. Actually, the 91 express lanes in Orange County that I helped start in the early 90s was the very first project in the United States, and then the Dulles Greenway in Virginia, started by former UMTA director Ralph Stanley, still in operation, was the second such project. In the last 15 years, we've had a number of other projects. Those are a few examples. I have a little bit more. What these are structured as long-term public-private partnerships. In other words, the public partner is usually the state DOT. The private partner is a company created by investors, sometimes a construction company, and a toll road operating company that has experience. And most of the operating companies are overseas companies because we don't have toll road operating companies. We never developed that industry in the United States. So that's why the companies from Spain, France, and Australia are running most of these, operating most of these, because they know how to run toll roads. They're financed by debt and equity. Equity is like the down payment you put on you when you buy a house. The debt is like a mortgage. It's generally revenue bonds and some other kinds of loans that they have to pay back. The toll revenue is counted on to pay back the debt and to earn a return eventually on the equity. Just like a lot of other, this is very much similar to the way investor-owned electric utilities operate. And these projects bring significant transfer of risks, especially mega project risks like late completion, cost overruns, and in the case of toll projects, of revenue falling short of what their projections show. We've had a few bankruptcies of these kinds of projects, including one here in California, in San Diego, SR 125. And we've seen several bankruptcies of these kinds of projects in Australia. Not a single one of those has had any taxpayer bailout of the investors or the companies involved. In other words, the risk, the revenue risk, and the cost over risk has in fact been transferred. And the good news of this is investors are still wanting to invest in good projects like this. So risk transfer is real. And one of the things about these projects is that if you're going to be the de facto owner-operator for 50 years, when you design and build a project, you have an incentive to take into account the life cycle cost over the 50 years. So you build it more durably. In most cases, you build it more durably, so your maintenance costs, which can sometimes, in U.S. highways, the maintenance cost over a 50-year life can be 2 or 3 times the initial construction cost. So if you can make that lower, and generally, FHWA study team went to Europe about a decade and a half ago to look at the pavement and so forth practices and procurement in Europe. They found on average European major highways are built more durably to begin with, so that they last longer and need less maintenance. In other words, they are more or less minimizing life cycle costs rather than initial costs, the way we continue to do in almost all highways in the United States. A very major, and guaranteed long-term maintenance for 2 reasons. Number one, it's in the company's interest. If people have a choice between using a tolled road or a non-tolled road, and you have potholes on both, well, that's kind of a no-brainer. Forget about paying a toll to ride on potholes. So they have a direct business incentive to have well-maintained roads. But it's also built into the long-term agreement, franchise agreement, that pavement roughness standards and so forth. And there are penalties if the pavement roughness gets beyond what is specified in the agreement. This is just 2 slides here, just summarizing, and anybody who wants a copy of the presentation, I'll be glad to send it to you. These are some of the major projects and a few specifics about them and the year in which the financing took place. And the total investment is $36 billion in this set of projects. Now, in one sense, that's a big number. In another sense, that's a drop in the bucket compared to the $1 trillion cost it's going to be minimal reconstruction of the second-generation interstate highway system. But it's a start at any rate, and it's mostly in a very few states that where public policy says this is a good idea, we want to encourage this, we will enact a sensible law that has the right conditions and so forth. Now here's a little fun part. One of the things that these toll finance projects, including public sector and private sector, are coming up with innovative design solutions to solve problems like how do you add capacity in an urban area to an expressway system. Well, here's one. A public sector toll agency in Tampa built this elevated project to add 3 reversible express lanes. This is a commuter route into downtown Tampa from a suburb. And so it goes inbound in the morning and outbound in the afternoon, the equivalent of 6 lanes on 6-foot pylons. So we're very conserving of right-of-way. They could, they have enough room to widen the lanes on the ground in the future if they need to. But the upper ones are, right now they're charging the same toll rates as the general toll rates, but these will be their variable price express toll lanes when they get to the point where they need to have 2 different price levels. Here's one that I drove on in Melbourne, Australia in 2000, a couple years after it opened. This is the Melbourne City Link, which is partly tunnel and partly elevated. It provides a missing link connecting several expressways to each other and with on and off ramps in the downtown of Melbourne. And this particular, the sound tube over there is to shield a high-rise residential building from noise exposure from the elevated roadway. The company, Transurban, did this on their own hook. Because they didn't want to get sued, they wanted to be a good neighbor and so forth. And it became a much photographed feature, that's why I included it. It's fun. And here was a grand project. This was the missing link for about 35 years on the A86 ring road around Paris. It was missing because there was huge local opposition to building the missing expressway there, because that goes right through Versailles and the palace. And, it's a historic area. Nobody so it was a stalemate. The road agency really needed this for mobility, but could not be built. So along comes one of the French toll road companies, investor-owned company, Coffee Group, and unsolicited proposal to the French government said, if you allow us to toll, the ring road is not tolled. If you allow us to use tolls for this, we will build it at our expense and charge variable pricing. And it would be a tunnel underneath, deep bore tunnel underneath, and it will include an underground interchange with the A13 right there. Pretty grandiose plan. It took some years of negotiating, and they eventually got permission to do it. And the one other condition that they ended up having to, the government had to agree to, was to 2.5 meter height for each of the deck, northbound and southbound decks, limiting it to cars only. And that was a trade-off the government decided it was worth making, because it's better to have the project serving cars only than to not have it at all. And that was the only way it could be privately financed. The government didn't have the money to finance it much bigger. This dramatically reduced the amount of excavation, which is the biggest cost of the tunneling. So, there's me standing with the guy from Coffee Group during the shakedown period before it was open to traffic. And you can see, it does not look that claustrophobic. It's the same dimensions basically as inside most U.S. parking structures. And this has been in operation since about 2007. I've not seen any financial figures. One presumes they're making money, or at least many of their debt service. So that's just an example that I love, because it was such a cool project. Now, where does the money come from? We have a thing that most people don't really appreciate called global infrastructure investment funds that have existed for about the last 15 to 20 years. In Europe, in Asia, and headquartered in New York, many of them. And U.S. and overseas pension funds are investing equity also, including CalPERS, by the way, and CalSTRS, and many other U.S. pension funds have started diversifying their portfolios of retirement funds to invest in infrastructure. You cannot invest in a government-owned airport or a government-owned road, because there's no equity, there's no way, they don't trade on markets. But these companies that do these projects, you can invest equity in them. So that's what the pension funds are doing. The debt market provides bonds and tolls of the revenue stream. And when I go to transportation conferences in the United States, the cry always is, oh, we have all these needs and there's not enough money, there's not enough money. We go to the infrastructure investment conference and say, we have gobs and gobs of money. Where are the U.S. projects? They're investing, they're building financing toll roads in Colombia where there's still guerrilla warfare going on. You can believe they would love to invest more in projects in the United States if only there were favorable public-private partnership laws in these countries. So the funds have raised $386 billion, the top 50 funds in the last 5 years. Overall, in a decade, they've raised over $500 million. And this could support, because the equity is usually about 25% of project, over $2 trillion worth of project. Now these are global funds. And so the money goes wherever they can, where they can find a realistic project. And so we're not getting a very big part of that right now. This is a report that came out from TRB, asked for by Congress in the FAST Act, on the future of the interstate highway system by a special expert committee of the TRB. Came out in December. Its conclusion, interstate is wearing out. We need to replace the majority of the pavement. And we need, there's numerous bottleneck interchanges. We need to widen some corridors, especially corridors heavy with truck traffic, and dedicated truck lanes could be a good idea. They did not include that in their recommendations and so forth. But Reason Foundation, they said it was going to cost a minimum of $1 trillion, and they argued for a new federal program that would give 90% federal funding and 10% state match, just like the original Eisenhower program in 1956, which would require quadrupling the federal gasoline and diesel taxes. So ha 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 if you think that's going to happen. Or that the money from all that would be dedicated to the interstates alone when there's 100 different programs that get money from the Federal Highway Trust Fund. So Reason Foundation has proposed instead doing this as toll financed with a combination of state toll agencies and investor-owned companies being responsible for financing, building, and operating and maintaining, with all electronic tolling and dedicated truck lanes where necessary, guaranteed built-in maintenance and so forth. And there's a report on our website about that. It's summarized in the book. And free-flowing freeways with some of them being cars only, possibly some segments being trucks only, and premium lanes, express toll lane networks on probably almost all or all of most freeways, because there's such a range of values of time with people. Charging the same price to everybody, very, very suboptimal. Research done at UC Berkeley 25 years ago started documenting that and it was further borne out by Ken Small's research at UC Irvine. So, how do we get this to happen? There's some simple federal policy changes that could be incorporated in the next highway bill. Incentives for states to use long-term public-private partnerships, P3s we call them, and the federal ban on interstate tolling, which is part of the original 1956 interstate legislation, and the federal ban on commercial rest areas, because the second-generation interstate system should have the same kind of full-service toll plazas that the toll road interstates have, and it's against the law currently. Expand tax-exempt financing for public-private partnerships, and continue the environmental streamlining for all major projects that's going on. So, to wrap up, I close the book by saying the status quo cannot and will not continue for three main problems. The federal government pretty soon is not going to be able to continue pouring general fund money into a failing highway trust fund, and it's going to get worse over time as the fuel revenue, tax revenue continues to decline. Secondly, state governments, most state governments have major problems with pension funds being grossly underfunded, and they are not in a position to have big increases in highway spending either to rebuild their interstates. And I showed you the graph about the fading of fuel tax revenue over the next 30 years or so. So those problems, the status quo that we've known for all of our transportation careers, will not and cannot continue. We need something new. And I think three new factors suggest that something like my model has a chance, at least, with a track record that gets bigger every year of these projects in many countries, including the small number in this country. The growth of the reality of the global infrastructure investment, money that's available and wants to invest more in the United States, and the need and desire of our pension funds here to diversify. If they had a lot more U.S. infrastructure to invest in, they would gladly do so if these were investment-grade projects. So my conclusions are, and this is the point of the book, our highway institutions really are failing. We have the same problems, only worse than we had 30 years ago. We've got to figure out significant reforms. I've laid out a set that I think would be a good set. It may not be the only, it's certainly not the only possibility, but I think they should be reconfigured as network utilities and paid for directly by the customers, like you get your highway bill, like you get your other utility bills. We already have per mile all electronic tolling in transponder tolling, like Fast Track in California is the first step toward that. Smartphone tolling is probably a wave of the future and will be even simpler and less costly. We have the long-term public-private partnership P3 model with a growing track record. Companies with impressive track records and new companies wanting to enter the United States market, and we have willing investors. So those are the ingredients. If we can put them together and get the federal policy changes and more state enabling laws, I think we've got a shot. And That's from book cover. The flyer gives you a discount if you want to take a flyer and buy it direct from the publisher. It's also available on Amazon and in a Kindle edition, which I have not actually seen, but they tell me they have it. And with that, I'll take questions. Thank you very much. Yes.
For the variable pricing tolling, will there be government regulations to make sure that toll rates are not so high that people feel discouraged from using them?
Yeah, I think all of these long-term agreements have some form of regulation of pricing. Generally, for long-distance interstates, what we see so far, like the Indiana toll road, is an annual. You cannot increase the tolls more than the consumer price index in any given year. Now, a company is not going to necessarily mean, okay, that means every year we increase it by the CPI, because they have to look at, what's the effect? Is it going to depress the number of users? If it goes up, if inflation is now 6% and you increase it 6% automatically without thinking about demand versus capacity. So, but it's a limit. For the express lanes where pricing is the means of controlling, I advocate no controls, because the places where we have controls, we have a cap on Florida's I-95 express toll lanes that I helped them implement. We have a cap on I-405 in Seattle. In both cases, there's a physical bottleneck there, and the cap prevents the price from rising high enough to have reasonably free flow past that bottleneck. The bottleneck is susceptible of physical improvements, which are planned, about to get underway in Seattle on 405. They're only sort of notional in a long-term desire in Florida, the bottleneck on I-95. So right now that price cap is really killing the performance and the afternoon rush hour on that particular express toll lane when there's no good reason for it. They have to have the political courage to do as other states are doing and say the price is the price on those. The whole point of it is to let basically a market price meter the flow. And sure, there needs to be some kind of government oversight to prevent that from being not justified by the algorithm that manages the flow. Government should be monitoring: are they meeting the minimum of 45 miles per hour in those lanes 90% of the time during peak periods? And if they're doing more than's needed to do that, then the government could question it. But no arbitrary price caps. I don't want to take more of that because just other people will have questions. We don't have much time. Yes.
There's a hierarchy of roads, starting with local roads to collectors to arterials to freeways. So how do you think about how far down does this concept reach?
Right. Well, this concept I think applies. I wrote the book with this applying to limited access highways. I think all limited access highways should be reconstituted as utility companies, whether government utilities or investor-owned utilities under franchises. I gave a few hints at the need to do some kind of per mile price for charging to replace fuel taxes for all the rest of the lower level roads. But I didn't work that out in the book. I have a paper coming out next week that we posted on the Reason of our website Tuesday, and I'm speaking about it in Washington Thursday, on a sort of a conceptual model for how a state could implement, after doing the limited access roads as the way that I outlined in the book, then, and getting people used to the idea of paying per mile where they weren't used to it before, then going to the public and saying, look, we need to do this for all the others, and here's a conceptual idea of how to do this. It's too long to explain in a few words here, but I urge you to download the paper on Tuesday and read it. And I'd love feedback on it too. But it's trying to get some elements of this model, a more business-like approach, but with state DOT being in charge of the lower level highways, and actually counties or regional government agencies being in charge with the urban region highways. They would get money from the state mileage-based user fee allocated to the different regions based on the measured amount of VMT previous year in that jurisdictional area and so forth. So it's too complicated to go beyond that for right now, but please read the paper and give me feedback. Yes?
How do public transport systems fit into this? Would like BART or something like that have to be privatized in order for this to work? And how would the benefits that highway drivers experience by having a good public transport system work in this?
Very, very good questions, and I don't have a full answer in the book. but let me give you a few hits on this. First of all, I think in most urban areas, express buses, BRT operating on variably priced lanes are by far the most cost-effective regional transit solution because they're flexible. They can go closer to door without changing vehicles or modes than any kind of rail transit can. And the cost, there's no infrastructure cost to the transit agency because the state DOT and investors and the toll payments pay for the guideway that's shared between motor vehicles, personal vehicles, and the express buses. So it's incredible. All the transit agency has to do is provide the capital and operating costs for the buses. And if we get autonomous buses, that would be even better, but let's leave that aside. So I think that is the best. Now, you've got existing systems like BART and so forth. I have an appendix in this new paper that's coming out Tuesday suggesting California self-help counties with transportation sales tax as a model. If the highways are going to be funded on a strictly user pays, user benefit basis, then we have to have a funding system for the transit systems that have been getting highway money, federal and state. And I think California is a great model for local transportation. It would be transit sales taxes. Then no more money from those sales taxes would go to highways once we have mileage-based user fees on all the roads. So that would be, and I think that would be a robust solution. Any metro area that has a large transit system now, I think could readily sustain it on dedicated transit-only sales taxes. And I think that's the best answer I know of right now. I'm open to suggestions for other things. Question from
Are there any state or federal legislatures that are in your area of?
Right. Well, I mean, I think if you look around, which states have done the most with these investor-owned public-private partnership things? Texas, there's now some backlash against some of them. There's doing more in Texas right now. But Texas has been a leader, Virginia has been a leader, Florida is a leader, Georgia is becoming a leader, Colorado and Indiana have done a few projects, and that's about it right now. So that's, and also on the question of states that want to use toll financing, if it were legal, to rebuild some of their interstates. There's about 10 states now where there's active discussion of this. In some states, legislation in some stage of gestation and debate. This includes Connecticut, South Carolina, Indiana, Wisconsin, and several, Illinois, several others. So that ball is starting to roll, and I think there's a lot of potential there. And I would love to see Congress in the 2020 reauthorization enact something like the voluntary proposal that I've suggested that allows states to request and get an exemption from the 1956 ban on interstate tolls if they agree to certain provisions and make it a true value proposition for the people who all of a sudden have to pay tolls for a new and improved interstate. They would only pay tolls, they would not have to pay the state fuel tax on the new improved thing, so there's no double taxation. And the money would have to be used solely for the capital and operating costs of the rebuilt interstates. A few other things like that. I think there's a chance. There's one senator who's expressed interest in drafting legislation and asked our help at Reason Foundation to review drafts of the legislation. I don't have any idea if it will go anywhere, but so there's actually discussion about that idea too. So and Oregon is the pioneer state on mileage-based user fees. They've had several pilot programs. Earlier this year, the legislature passed and the governor signed a statewide program that anybody who owns a vehicle that gets more than 20 miles per gallon, so no gas filters, can switch from the gas taxes to paying a 1.7 cent per mile charge, road user charge. That's the first state that's done it on that kind of scale. There's been a pilot project. California's participated in a couple pilot projects. Washington State, Minnesota's had a few. My wife is now taking part in a I-95 corridor coalition pilot project on mileage-based user fees. And a little gadget plugged into the ODB port under her dashboard. That's just starting. So a lot of work is going on, and Reason Foundation is a charter member of the Mileage-Based User Fee Alliance, and it's a good organization. I don't know how many members, but it has a number of state DOTs are members, a number of technology companies that are working on some of this stuff are members, and so it's a work. They have worked hard to get Congress to do pilot projects for mileage-based user fees, because there's a lot we still don't know about how people respond to these things. So, yeah.
You had mentioned that there was some backlash in Texas against these
Yeah.
triple Ps.
Yeah.
What motivated that?
The backlash in Texas is a kind of conservative populist backlash led by the current Republican governor and a number of Republican populist legislators. It's reacting to grassroots campaigns that said, we're up to here with all the tolling in Texas, and we don't want any more of it. They're not saying take it away. A few of them said that, but that was completely you know. TxDOT did a study looking at the bounded indebtedness that would have to be paid off if they took away tolls. $30, $50 billion or something, and there's no way in hell that would possibly be considered. But they wanted to move, they've gotten basically a de facto moratorium, and P3s got included in that because all the P3s in Texas are toll financed. And I think that's the right way to do a highway P3. So Texas legislature meets only every 2 years. And this was one of their legislative years. There was group coalitions, including State Chamber of Commerce and others, that wanted to end the moratorium on toll projects, or at least allow tolling on a new project if there was local support that could be demonstrated by either by majority votes of the governing bodies in those urban areas or a local referendum. That didn't get anywhere either. So it's still no new toll project in Texas can be done if there's any state money involved. And only P3 projects based on a law they passed about 4 years ago. Every year when the Texas legislature meets, TxDOT has to come to them. Here's a list of the P3 projects we want to do. The legislature has to say yes or no to each one. You don't get micromanaged. But this year they said, just no projects. So there were 30-some projects on TxDOT's list. They didn't approve a single one. And this has caused great wailing and gnashing of teeth in the big urban areas, which had plans for many more express toll lanes. We were going to do double-deck I-35 through downtown Austin, which is a parking lot, but monumental proportions. And there was lots of local support for doing this. And the legislature said, no, you don't know what's best, we know what's best. Yes.
In a perfect world, would you roll this out nationally all at the same time, or how would you?
No, and I think both for the interstate tolling and for the conversion from per gallon to per mile, by far the most sensible way is to do it state by state. Let it be a state-led initiative at the option of the decision-making state. You have to get local buy-in for this. There's a number of people that are proposing the federal government needs to take the lead, impose a national federal mileage-based user fee that then the states could piggyback on, and there would be standardization. But that ignores, this is very unpopular. Public opinion surveys show that only about maybe 20% of people think this would be a good idea. They see it as Big Brother in their car. I mean, a lot of those things are wrong, but that's what the public perception is. Until if Congress tries to mandate that on people, there's huge uprising against it. It will never pass. And it would set back, I think, the whole course of these things. So that's why I think giving states options, having federal policy to the extent we have policies, be permissive to states as long as they do deal fairly with the people who are expected to pay, and give guidance and stuff, not force these things on states. And the states own all these roads. And you may or may not know that the interstate highways that were 90% federal funded are owned by the state governments. They're not owned by the federal. The federal government only owns roadways on national parks and a few other federal properties. So it's the state's responsibility to do this, and I think that's properly said. Federal role, the interstate system is a system. It's designed to flow commerce and travel and so forth. It needs to have uniform standards and so forth. There's a clear federal role to do that, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the funder. In a more likely than my ideal scenario, the states would take the primary role in rebuilding and managing interstates. The federal government would probably have a program to help the states where the tolls, the population was too low to make it fully toll supported. We identified in the study that we did in 2013 with Interstate 2.0, about 5 states were just what you just could not. It was just the costs were too high because of mountains like in Vermont. The traffic demand was too low. You never do that there, not in our lifetimes anyway. But if the interstates still need to be rebuilt, then probably be a federal role. You need the whole system. So federal role could be a help out role where it can't be done entirely the way I would want to see it.
Is there a possibility that after enough P3s are built that the companies will start to like consolidate and take over each other? And would that be bad? And if it is bad, how would you prevent that?
Well, we have a thing called antitrust laws, and that's probably the way, control mechanism that's been already there that we most sensible to do. I'm not an expert on antitrust law, but rather than imposing arbitrary restrictions in advance, I would say if that turns out to be the case, that would be the way to do it. Now, it's interesting that in Australia, one company that has been the leading company has continued to buy out other things, and now has the majority of all the expressways in Sydney or area, and the majority of the expressways with some partners, but the Transurban is the lead company in that thing, and the majority of all the expressways in Brisbane also. And so far, I mean, they have competition laws. They don't call them antitrust competition laws, they have competition commission. And I have not heard of anybody bringing a case to them. But I think that could happen sometime in the next few years, particularly if that company makes a few more acquisitions and it looks like almost the only major player. I think a lot of people feel uncomfortable with that. But being, the trend in antitrust in the United States over the last 30 years has been not size per se, but are consumers being hurt? And I think that's a better standard than per se size. So if consumers start to get hurt by consolidation of these companies, then yeah, competition laws, antitrust laws, I think would be the right place to start with looking at that and saying, are people being hurt, and therefore is there a remedy to break some of these up? And there's also what I see happening in Europe and other countries with the infrastructure funds. There's a lot of buying and selling going on in pieces of these companies that have long franchises. And so I write a report on this every year on transportation finance. And so it looks at highlights of the things that are going on. And it's fascinating to see. An infrastructure fund wants to buy 10% of this thing that has another 25 years in its franchise. And there's market transactions, and if they pay a reasonable price for it, they go on. And no government has tried to prevent any of those so far in Europe. But these are still relatively new industries. Both of those toll roads that are now investor-owned in France and Spain and Portugal and Italy were originally mostly government companies. And between 1999 and 2001, it's all in the book, they were privatized. And as government, they were perpetual monopolies on each road. But once they became privatized, they were turned into concessions with a limited number of years, after which the government can decide what to do. So that is one remedy, that these are not permanent franchises, they are time limited. And there's always the market for corporate control that they can be bought out by some other vital pieces of them, and you have different shareholders. Interestingly enough, the Indiana Toll Road and the Chicago Skyway, which were both privatized, quote unquote, by commercial companies in the 2000 first decade of the century. The Indiana Toll Road filed Chapter 11 because they were hit bad by the downturn in traffic after the Great Recession. And the Chicago Skyway was not doing well financially. Both were bought out by consortiums of pension funds. So they are 100% owned today, those long-term franchises, by Canadian and U.S. public pension funds. And actually, it's almost Australian. So that's a fascinating phenomenon. And pension funds they're designed to protect these are public sector employee pensions, designed to protect the retirement of public sector employees. So you have this interesting thing where historically, public sector unions have been very opposed to trends toward privatization of infrastructure. And yet their pension funds are now investing in these very companies, these very concepts, in order to safeguard, to have better returns on the investment you're looking for 8 to 9% returns, when their average is trying hard to get an average here of 7%. We're out of time.
No worries. We just hit 5 p.m. Thank you everyone for being here, and especially thank you to our speaker for your presentation. I'd like to give you a small token of appreciation for my guests.